talk with us for just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so, about some of the latest initiatives, some of the things that he wants us to know, and then we will begin the questioning. There are cards that are being passed around by Javier, and you should write down any questions that you have. Feel free to include the name of your institution if you would like that known, and we will ask those questions along the way. So, Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here. As I said, I'm a big CUNY fan, having a degree from Hunter College, so always promoting CUNY. So I just wanted to say a little bit about what it is our agency does, and sort of some of the new initiatives. So we are the largest local funding agency for the arts in the United States, by far. There's actually nobody really in second place. After the federal government, there's us. We have a budget that includes things like, oh, there we go. We are the landlord and the owner of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Natural History, the zoos, the gardens, the Queens Museum, the Bronx Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, Carnegie Hall, BAM, etc. There are 33 institutions on city property where we pay heat and light and some operating support. We also give grants to 950 other cultural organizations all over the city, from very small to very large, and we give grants that go through the local funding agencies in each borough. We have a program called Materials for the Arts, which gives out free materials to arts groups. And so what I have with me, which my colleague Ryan Max here has, is I'd like to hand out, if anybody's interested in that question of how do people get involved and get money from or materials from our agency, or how does an individual artist apply to get funding to do a public artwork, we have a piece of paper that shows you how to get through to our website. We can share that with everybody, but we want to make sure that the doors are open in as many ways as possible. So we have some new initiatives at the agency. By the way, this agency's been around since the 70s, but we have been supporting arts and culture in New York City since the 19th century. That idea of having organizations where we own the building and it's on city property, we pay heat and light, that started with natural history and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 1870s and has been going on for almost a century and a half. So some of the new initiatives, one of the things that when Mayor de Blasio came into office, there was this whole question of sort of equity and inclusion. And one of the big questions, nationally is, what does the workforce at cultural institutions look like? Who's working at these institutions? So there was commissioned a study on cultural workforce participation, and we actually required all of our grantees to participate in this. And we got information on about 37,000 employees and another 10,000 board members. And while New York City is 2/3 people of color, identifying as people of color, about 2/3 of the workforce at cultural institutions is white. So this is something that, by the way, is pretty much better than national averages, if you could believe that. We're also in a much more diverse place than the average New York American city. So we've done some things about that. We launched something called the CUNY Cultural Core this year with funding from Rockefeller Foundation and from the administration. So we have a bunch of CUNY undergraduates who are working on paid internships at cultural institutions. I think there are 75 of them placed right now. It's going to expand hopefully in future years. And we have about $4 million of funding total towards diversity initiatives. I think everybody knows that one of the big successes of the administration has been the ID card. And I actually don't have good answers to exactly how the data is going to be handled and all that stuff, but I would have to defer to other members of the administration. But in terms of the ID card, the municipal ID card, I think everybody knows that 900,000 people now have that. We attached a cultural benefit to that, which says if you have the ID card, you can also get free one-year memberships at 37 cultural institutions, and over 400,000 free memberships have been redeemed by ID card holders. We have been working on expanded program called Building Community Capacity, which is working to create sort of horizontal networks within 4 communities in New York City. And we've also initiated something called the Public Artist in Residence program, where we've been pairing artists with residencies in city agencies. So an example of that would be
At the Administration for Children's Services, there's an group of artists who are working with 4 LGBTQ foster homes in Queens and Brooklyn, producing short videos with the residents there. And those artists, by the way, are a group of young people who all came out of Pace University and who all identify as LGBTQ people of color. It's an amazing group. It's a moving program. We have artists in residence at the Department of Design and Construction, at Veterans Affairs, and at Immigrant Affairs. So those are some of the new programs that we've launched. We continue to do the things we've been doing again, those funding cultural institutions. We give out capital grants when organizations are building a new building or buying new equipment. And then finally, I think very relevant today, I'd love to talk about this as much as possible and to talk to everybody in the room. The City Council passed a law last year that requires the first ever cultural plan for New York City. The cultural plan is not just a plan for how we spend money at our agency, but for the cultural life of New York City in general. So, for example, the Department of Education spends hundreds of millions of dollars on arts education. When the city of Chicago did their cultural plan, the #1 recommendation by the people of Chicago was, we want better, sequential arts education in the public school system. So it wasn't even a recommendation for the Cultural Affairs Department. There are issues that relate to affordability for artists in New York City, public space, the distribution of cultural resources equitably across the city. All this is being addressed. We've had a series of workshops already. We had one in Queens at the Hall of Science recently, and I will say that it was well attended. A couple hundred people were there. We did have several Spanish language tables when we broke up into the tables, and Mandarin language. So we had capacity. It was signed for ASL. One of the things that we're very, very interested in is also reaching out to disability communities, both in terms of the talent that's in that community, the artists, as well as the perhaps 10% of the city that self-identifies as disabled. So with all the kind of interconnections that are in this room right now, we'd love to talk to you guys about how to get the folks who are in communication through your papers to be part of the cultural plan, because everybody deserves rich cultural life. I think lots of people are participating in it. I happen to believe that there are a lot of small cultural organizations that don't feel like they have a connection to our agency yet. So we need to connect to your constituents and get your constituents to connect to us. I will say that for example, in our commissioners unit, right now, we have expanded our language capabilities to Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Arabic recently. So there's stuff happening. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's my introduction.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Commissioner. Traven.
Oh, actually, I was curious about, to expand on that note, because I cover the Lower East Side in Manhattan, and over the last 20 years, there's been a huge drop in actual organizations that have had to close art venues, live venues, because of skyrocketing real estate. And I know that's a hot topic for everybody, but it's becoming a crisis in our neighborhood right now. So I'm curious what you guys are doing, if anything.
So, I think that the affordability question is just this crazy question in general. The real estate market is really hot. Part of it is just the kind of the success of New York City as a city that we're pulling all these people in. There are other cities which are kind of waiting generation after generation for neighborhoods to get hot. With that said, one of the questions is with the arts community, and this is different from your question has to do with organizations. We were talking to some friends of ours over at City Planning to find out, do you think artists are actually leaving the city? Because there's anecdotal evidence that people are. And so I think that the answer to that is no. I think that there's still large numbers of young people. So the net increase in the last 10 years where we have data of people under 30 with college degrees is plus 250,000. So every year, 25,000 new net between the people leaving and the people coming back. So I don't want to in any way diminish what you're saying. I think it's a looming crisis. I think that what's happening in places like the Lower East Side, is you'll see a lowering of arts groups there. But if you go to Ridgewood, Queens, for example, I think you're going to see an increase in performing arts facilities, et cetera. So people are relocating. I know in Rockaway, where I'm quite familiar with what's going on out there, there's lots of places popping up, even galleries are popping up there, venues that are doing live music, et cetera. So part of it is a redistribution. I think that the question of affordability is so broad that it's not just about the arts or artists, it's about livability in the city, retaining talent, et cetera. So things like the housing plan for 200,000 units of either conserved or created affordable housing is more important at some level. Within that plan, there are three groups that are singled out: veterans, seniors, and artists. So we are going to build affordable housing for artists, but it's only 1,500 units, so you have to look at the whole broader vision. So I don't think that there is an easy answer. I think that one of the questions in the cultural plan is affordability for organizations and artists. So we're looking for input from the public on that question.
What's the timetable for the cultural plan?
The cultural plan, so we've actually had 47 public meetings already, meaning focus groups, and we just have done 2 of the larger public meetings. So, okay, we're in the open session, getting input part up through the spring, and then at the sometime probably in April or so, we're going to issue a draft plan, and we're going to adopt the plan by the end of the last day of the fiscal year. We are required by law to deliver it to the city council. So what happened in Boston, I think it was Boston, unfortunately the plan was leaked and people freaked out. So what we want to do in New York is release it intentionally when there's a draft, not just send it around to some people, but send it around publicly for people to respond. But before we do the draft, we want everybody's input. So that's the timeline. We're doing the outreach now. The next meeting is in Brooklyn at Brick in downtown Brooklyn on December 6th. There's a website, createnyc.org, createnyc.org, that has all the timetables, and you can sign up to get notifications.
Are you going to start with the question?
Oh, yeah. So we did have a big picture question.
Yes.
It's on everybody's mind, I think, about the looming change in the federal administration.
Yeah.
And just historically knowing that Republican administrations tend to cut arts funding, and if that's something that you guys are anticipating, and how you think it might trickle down and to affect the city.
So, look, I mean, I can't get too political here, but first of all, I will say that it was under the Nixon administration that the National Endowment for the Arts blossomed into a real agency. So it hasn't been across the board. I don't think Trump said anything about the arts at all that I could discern. I was listening carefully. I don't think he said anything. So, but there have been Republicans who have, advocated for getting rid of the National Endowment for the Arts altogether. New York City per capita spending on arts is so far greater than the federal government's. So 1 out of 37 people in the United States lives in New York City. So, which means if you have proportional, then the federal government budget should be 37 times larger than ours, right? And it's not, it's like twice, right? So our support of the arts, this mayor has been very pro-arts. We had $10 million added to the budget this year. First time in a long time we've added money to the budget for the arts. The capital budget has been very robust. There's no indication that's going to change. So really it's a matter, the mayor gave a speech about staying the course. Like, we're going to keep going on the initiatives we've been doing, and that would translate into the arts as well.
So you're not worried at the moment?
Worried, I don't know. I mean, all we can do is to stay the course with what we need to do here in New York City.
And do you normally leapfrog over any state agencies and deal directly with the National Endowment?
No. I mean, the only connection really we've had with the National Endowment for the Arts, there have been some initiatives, like there was a initiative up in the South Bronx in Mott Haven, where we got some NEA funding. We're in contact. I mean, I've met Jane Chu, who's the head of the National Endowment for the Arts. She comes to New York from time to time. But, we're not in day-to-day contact with the NEA.
Let me start with some questions about the local groups, because we always hear DCA giving money to a lot of big organizations and not to a small organizations. So at the same time, the city is focused on inclusion and diversity. So can you tell us what is the funding for minority ethnic groups?
So we actually fund 950 different groups in New York City. And that the funding for, this is the Cultural Institutions Group, which is those groups on city property. The idea, when people think of it, is the Metropolitan Museum and Natural History, these very large groups. But it includes El Museo del Barrio, it includes Studio Museum in Harlem, Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning. It includes organizations in all the boroughs. It includes a number of organizations in Staten Island. So there is a robust funding citywide. I don't have statistics specifically on how many groups from organizations of color. It's very hard to parse exactly what that means, right? So how do you define that in terms of, let's say, ownership, right? So business ownership, MWBE, minority, firms register as an MWBE, and you can tell what percentage. That's not the case for cultural institutions. But one of the things that we've been considering is how to hit every community. So one of the things that there's a study called the Social Impact of the Arts Study. University of Pennsylvania has a think tank that's been working on that for about 18 months, and that study's going to come out, and that's going to really map the distribution of cultural resources across the city. And one of the things that they're quite interested in is what neighborhoods, and this kind of place-based analysis, are particularly rich in cultural resources beyond what you'd expect from economics. And so that's a really interesting study. It's going to come out in a couple of months, which will probably have better answers than we've ever had before to the questions you're asking.
But you mentioned that you funded 950 different organizations.
Yes.
What is the budget for that?
So the budget for that this year, I think, was $32 million.
32 million?
Yeah.
So this leads to and the other question
And
is
that, by the way, that went up by $4 million.
I know that you are meeting in different neighborhoods. The meeting in Queens was at the Hall of Science.
Yes, correct.
2 weeks ago or something.
Yeah, right.
Like 300 people attended. Can you tell us some findings that you found in those meetings?
Yes. I mean, so this is very, very preliminary at this time. And so one of the questions is, how do you go from a bunch of public meetings to a set of findings, right? So what we're looking for is patterns. Like, so if it is the case that one meeting after the next you go and people want X, then that's going to be, integrated into the plan. So one of the things I would say that was quite striking in Queens, and which I said right there. So we had these, I think, how many tables? Like 30 tables, which were pondering different issues, and then everybody came up and reported afterwards. So we stood there for a half an hour, and these have been lengthy, hour and a half long discussions, and they were reporting back. And again, this was simultaneously translated in Spanish and Mandarin. So one of the biggest recommendations from that particular meeting had to do with interconnection and collaboration across sectors with small organizations in the boroughs. So it's like, how do you get the locally based organizations to work together and also to work together with the larger institutions in the borough? So for example, we're at the Hall of Science, which for Queens is a very large institution. It's the largest budget of any cultural institution in Queens. How do you connect that with, let's say, Corona Youth Orchestra or, the other, that's what a lot of it was being discussed. Interconnection and collaboration was a big overlying topic. And then one of the things that just comes up over and over again is quality arts education in the public school system. And that was discussed at some length.
So it's my understanding that you obviously fund nonprofit organizations.
Yes.
And then there's borough arts councils that can fund or re-grant for individuals.
Yes.
And for organizations that are not
Much
operating as
usually
nonprofit.
smaller.
Very
Yeah, yeah.
small.
Right, yeah. So if I may.
Yeah, please.
When I was appointed, there was a news conference, and then a reporter came up to me and said, what do you want to do as commissioner? And I said, look, I believe in the big institutions, but I also know that there are a lot of Sri Lankans in Staten Island, and I'll bet you they have a dance group, and I'll bet you it's important for that community. And so then I got to the agency, and the Sri Lankan dance group from Staten Island called me up and said, you should come out and meet us, right? So that group had been getting a little bit of funding as individual artists because they were not incorporated as a nonprofit, right? They've been around for 24 years. They do a big performance at the College of Staten Island every year. So that's one of the questions also, is how to get more fundamentally connected. There's also the for-profit art world it's not just Broadway and the commercial galleries. It's music venues that present, music. I mean, there's a Tibetan place in Jackson Heights that is a cultural center, really is. It's used to call it, I can't remember the name of it. They actually changed the name a couple of times. But they present music, and that's a kind of a center of Tibetan culture there. It's a for-profit institution. It's a restaurant, right? So one of the big questions that we've never, I don't think public funding agencies ever really connect well with that kind of grassroots activity. And so how do you do that? And the way we've been able to do it is through the Arts Council funding, for example, the Sri Lankan dance group, the choreographer as an individual artist.
How do you identify those groups in the community?
So that's
Who are
right.
like the good ones, the bad ones, or I don't know. You have
So
a criteria?
So they apply to us, right? And so with the ones who apply directly, it's called CDF funding. That's the $32 million I was talking about. They apply, and we have a panel process. And the panel process is, a diverse group of outside professionals. They come forward, and they do it by medium and sometimes by borough and by size of organization. So if you have about half of the groups who apply to us have a budget under $250,000. These are often groups who have one or no employees. So you think of cultural organizations and everything from, I don't know, the Met might have 2,000
You say
employees.
250,000?
Yeah, half the groups of that 950 have a budget under 250,000. So that's a category. So you have these small groups in communities often that have one or no employees, might have a $75,000 budget or less. So those either apply directly to us for this for the panels or to the local arts councils. It's a much less bureaucratic process. So we have a small staff, and our staff is experts in sort of the art world of New York City. But it really is up to the groups to come to us. So it's not that we're going out and saying, you are great, you Sri Lankan dance group in Staten Island is great, come and apply. We do once a year these sessions in each borough where we go out and but there's not that much recruiting. It's really up to the groups to find us and apply. So that's a question.
Is there a way to make that process easier for the groups? Because all we hear is that it is difficult to put the group together, and then it's more difficult to ask for money.
Yes.
Sometimes they need to hire an expert to do that.
That's right.
And they also said that they have to wait a lot of time to get the money. And sometimes the money is approved just, okay, this is only 5% or 10% of a biggest project. So you have to find the other money. So it's like they have to go to the bank, to loan the money, pay interest, and at the same time, it's going to be part of a bigger project. So it's like...
So that, we actually are thinking a lot about how to try to make it easier. And one of the ways to make it easier, especially if it's a small grant, is when it goes through the arts councils. It's less. Look, if you're engaging the government in funding, there's certain legal requirements that we, in terms of insurance and this and that we just have to do. We're trying to figure out how to streamline it, first of all. We are considering the possibility, although this is not definite, of multi-year funding. Like, so if you apply, you can get 3 years of funding. That there's good and bad reasons. You give up the opportunity to get more money the second year, whatever. We do have a policy that says that we will not fund more than 50% of an organization's budget. So if an organization has an overall budget of $40,000, they can't get a grant for more than $20,000 from us. That's a rule that sort of shows that the organization itself has its own supporters, right? So, you know, it does take time, but we've been, I think, compared to other public funding agencies, quite efficient in getting the grants out relatively early in the fiscal year. But believe me, these are the kind of things we think about all the time. And it's not easy to answer, actually.
And then in that note, I would say I hear from a lot of executive directors at organizations that they get sort of project-based funding as
Right.
opposed to operating
Yeah, that's
expenses.
correct. So we fund, and that actually has to do with the way we're chartered. It's a kind of a technical. So the cultural institution group, that group of 33 institutions, again, which include some big ones and some small ones, get general operating support and energy. The others, it's programmatic support.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something also that might require sort of charter revision or something like that. The governing I was just talking to our lawyers about this today. Could we go to a model that allowed for general operating support? And again, these are the kind of things that could be a recommendation of the cultural plan. Right now, we are not we are not able to give general operating support outside of the cultural institution group.
So that in turn kind of covers staff, for example. So they say,
Right.
I'm hearing that they say we can't keep staff because we can't give them raises, so we can never have sort of these qualified people because we can't afford to pay them enough, and
Right.
that's kind of the never-ending cycle.
That is a big problem with small nonprofits in general, right? So that's not just in the cultural field. But yeah, I mean, and then the other problem there has to do, even if you think about the diversity initiative, if you're encouraging the large-scale cultural institutions to be hiring diverse staff, guess where they're going to find them? They're going to find people at smaller nonprofits who have been trained at great expense by organizations that then, it's like brain drain, right? So where you get your medical degree in India and then you come work in America, and the Indian, the country has provided all the resources to create a doctor, right? It's the same kind of problem can happen in the cultural field, and same with boards as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that, the deal that we have in New York City is so much better than any other American city. I have to say, not just the amount of money, but the per capita. There's only one city in America that has more money per capita for culture, which is San Francisco, because of a big hotel tax. But aside from San Francisco, I mean, these organizations should be fighting for better deal, but they have a very, very good access to money compared to other cities. So it's not quite a European model, but it's much, much better than other big American cities.
Let me change the conversation a little bit and focus on I'm from Queens, Latino. So in Queens, there are no places to hold public cultural events. When a small cultural group wants to celebrate something, they don't have a space, they have to rent it, they don't have the money. So it's a big, big problem. Is the city thinking on alleviating that? Because maybe it's the same problem that the Lower East Side is confronting, or the South Bronx is confronting. Places to perform, places to gather, places to play, places to enjoy life.
So, I mean, so we're a funding agency, right? So we're not an agency that would create a new venue, right? So if there were a new venue in the process of being created, we could be funding that organization, right? But one of the things also that we're thinking about is partnerships, for example, with the library system. So every community in Queens has a library, and those are vibrant cultural institutions at some level. And so is there a way to better connect the cultural resources of communities with the libraries? And the other thing, again, what was being discussed at the Hall of Science was better coordination and collaboration between the groups that do exist.
Yeah, but I have the feeling that you are not answering my question. Is like, what is happening and you know this because you were the executive director of the CUNY Museum, right? you can try to do something there, and it's difficult to get there. And you know that the nearby is the Queen's Theater,
Yep.
and they were holding for 17 years the Latino Cultural Festival,
Yep.
right? And then that festival disappeared, and nobody did anything, and it's the only cultural festival to celebrate Latino culture, probably in New York, and the city didn't care.
So that was funded by J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan ended the
Chase.
funding. J.P. Morgan Chase, right? So, but so the theater itself is there rent-free. It is, getting support from the city. So the city supports a bunch of cultural institutions. The Queens Museum, also had many festivals at various different times for a lot of the groups that were local. So, I mean, I'm not exactly sure that we have funding available if people apply. If there is a, the El Museo del Barrio exists on the Upper East Side of Manhattan because there was a community push to find a space, essentially, actually at that time, for Puerto Rican culture. And there was a concerted campaign to open a space on behalf. But that was something where groups had an idea. Here it is. We have a coalition. We got a board. And they came with the idea. So we're not going to initiate the idea. But if the idea comes to us, and maybe the idea of the cultural plan could be, this could be a recommendation of the cultural plan, that whatever, the Queens needs a venue like that.
So basically what you're saying is the lack of ideas from, the Latino community to get a good festival there?
I mean, if that, I don't want to say that the ideas aren't there, but it's the coalition to create, say that this is the priority. Like to say, if we kept hearing over and over again in meetings, or groups are coming to us, that we need a meeting space in Queens to do X, Y, and Z, then maybe that's a recommendation that could come out of it. So I mean, look, I know the festival you're talking about quite well, and it wasn't something where the city pulled any funding away from that. The corporation who had been funding it for many years pulled away, and then they tried to find another corporation to step in to be the funder, and they couldn't find it.
I have another question related to the Queens Museum. One, it is difficult to get there,
Yes.
right? So there is no train.
It's not difficult to get there if you live in Corona.
Yeah.
And so,
But
so this is the thing. So one of the things that, and I could talk, very much about that, is the overall transportation question, which actually did come up at the Queens Hall of Science as well, is not something that we can really address in the cultural plan. But the idea, so the Queens Museum, one of the things that we did there, first of all, was to create a much more multilingual staff. And by the time that I left, there were actually 8 people who's on the staff, forgetting guards and maintenance and security, just of the professional staff who spoke Spanish as their first language. We had Mandarin speaking, Hindi, Hakka, actually a lot of different languages. And then we had community organizers working in Corona who were fluent in Spanish. And we did a lot of programming in Corona Plaza. So there was an idea of saying, let's get out into, that's 103rd Street, and you know where it is.
Corona Plaza, yes.
So the point there was that it wasn't enough to open the doors, that it had to be sort of this explicit invitation, or even get outside the doors into the community to do programming. So one of the questions is, is there a way to promote more of that within the cultural plan? But I mean, to say the Queens Museum is hard to get to depends on where you are, right? So if it's very easy to drive there from Flushing or to walk there from Corona, it's very hard to get a lot of places if you live in whatever.
So why do you think it's so difficult to get Latinos into the museum?
I think it was something that the Latino audience increased a lot during the time that I was there. I don't think it's particularly
Yeah, because some people say that the lack of programming that attract Latinos. Sometimes you visit the Queens Museum and it's an exhibition from South Africa.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
That's true.
I know they don't
Not South
promote
Africa.
they don't promote local artists.
But that's not true either. And so the first show that I put on the agenda at the Queens Museum was something called Queens International, which is local artists. It happens every couple of years. And but no, one of the issues with Queens also was that we did there was a lot of programming that was artists from Latin America. There were different parts of Latin America that people might be more or less interested in, right? But there's also did a lot of Asian programming. So there was you could walk into the museum and not have anything particularly oriented towards a Latino audience, but it might be interesting to an Asian audience. And with an Asian, it might be Korean or it might be Chinese. It's one of those issues in Queens that there's such diversity that even if you are really focusing on diversity all the time, you can't, a lot of the time you're not going to be satisfying particular audiences.
A follow-up to that. There are a lot of groups. I live walking distance from the Brooklyn Museum. And I remember when they began their sort of first Saturdays.
Yes.
They did all kinds of different programs
Yep.
to get people, just get them in the building.
Yep.
And then, memberships and other things would follow from that. There are a lot of smaller organizations that would like to try those kind of things, but they need marketing professionals. They need ideas. They
Yep.
need sort of forums and perhaps some funding to make that happen. Is there anything that your agency does to help?
So, I mean, the thing that we're doing, so there is this program called Building Community Capacity, and we're working in 4 targeted neighborhoods and exactly that kind of thing, which is to say that there are small nonprofit organizations that are, probably doing a very good job at what they do, but they don't necessarily have really in-depth expertise in terms of marketing or fundraising or reading a spreadsheet to create the proper budget that's going to be the budget when you hand it into your funder that people are going to, find to be at that level where you have the confidence in the organization. So right now we're working in Jamaica, Queens, East New York, Washington Heights, and the South Bronx. And these are coalitions of groups, and this has been a very, very successful model right now. And those groups work together over a period of a couple of years, and they actually create a coalition that then hires their own director with then professional development support from our staff and from consultants who come in and help with those kind of those kind of issues, right? So it's capacity building. And what we found is we were doing that in a way that was very citywide. So Corona Youth Orchestra, for example, participated one year, along with a group from the Bronx, et cetera. What we found was making it place-based and creating these community coalitions, which include individual artists, which include nonprofits, which include faith-based organizations, et cetera, was more effective to make it, then those coalitions are mutually reinforcing and create the kind of boundary crossing collaboration that makes everybody stronger.
So we've been covering this. There's redevelopment happening on a big scale on the Lower East Side, and there's a whole bunch of city-owned parcels that are being redeveloped right now. So I would love to hear what your ideal version of how that might work for the community to decide, because they did get to weigh in quite a bit on what they wanted. But as far as cultural institutions, for them to say what would be great to have here, sort of what would that process be ideally from your point of view?
I'm not sure that I have an answer to that question. I think that the cultural plan is going to give us a set of priorities, I think, in relationship maybe to that question. So, there's a question, for example, is it more important to a community to retain the artists who are there through, let's say, affordable studio spaces with some sort of real focus on the artists who live there? Is that more important than having a cultural facility? In some neighborhoods, you want to bring tourism is important because it's important for local businesses to have people coming in from the outside to patronize the business. That wouldn't happen with artist studios, but that might happen more so with, let's say, a community center / arts museum. So I think that right now we are doing this really intensive outreach. Like I say, I'm going to meetings, I'm speaking in public numerous times every day, quite often, to really get the sense of what it is that the priorities are. And the priorities might be quite different from community to community as well. So I don't think there's an answer that's true for the Lower East Side that's necessarily true for Flatbush, or that Flatbush has the same answer as Riverdale.
But you would want it to be shaped by the community and sort of have them
Yeah,
decide
but I also,
the
so
priorities.
yes, yes, absolutely. The other thing to not forget, and not, is that there are these big cultural institutions like the Metropolitan Museum, which we've been funding for, 150 years. We have 70 million tourists coming to New York City every year. Half of them say arts and culture are either the first or second reason they're here. So 35 million people come basically for culture. Those people are coming for things like Broadway or the Met or the Whitney or whatever. And those are very important institutions as well. When I was actually leaving the Queens Museum to take this job, I ran into two young women in the halls at the Queens Museum. One was Dominican and the other was Tibetan. They both lived in Queens. And I said, "What's your favorite cultural institution?" Hoping they would say the Queens Museum, where they were doing an internship, paid. And they said, "The Museum of Natural History. I love that place. I go there all the time. I brought my parents there. I got a family pass." And it was important for them to have a cultural institution locally where they were engaged and to get out of the community and go to Manhattan, to this big place. It's a very complicated formula. I've heard that all over the city as well. We want things in our community that are vibrant, and we want to get to another place and experience something else. Wow, we're getting a big pile of...
Yes. I gotta get to some. This is a standard question. What's the best way to get information from your agency?
Yep.
Who handles the media inquiries? How do we reach that person?
Okay, so would you stand up, Ryan Max? Okay, Ryan and Dion is from our staff here. You guys stand up. So we have a couple people here. Ryan is the media guy, and so there's the information from our agency. Get in touch with Ryan, and he'll handle press inquiries. Right? Anything else I should say about that, Ryan? We do have that piece of paper also, which just is sort of, if you want to tell your constituents, your readers or your listeners or whatever, here's a piece of paper that says, here's how you can apply for money, here's how you can apply for commissioners, et cetera.
Okay. Our organization did a study on the percentage of official advertising done with community media outlets. Found that we get nowhere near the level of advertising that the size of their specialized audience deserve. The mayor's office has promised to do better, but we know that a lot of this is done at the agency level. And there are multiple versions of this question. Marketing and outreach to ethnic communities, Black community in particular. Will you make a committed effort to use Black-owned media? How tightly do you work with minority newspapers to let communities know about your opportunities? It's the advertising that I think.
So we don't do any advertising at all. We haven't bought a single ad since I've been commissioner. We don't have a budget for that. There are other agencies that might do that. But, so then, that might answer that question. It isn't straight up in terms of advertising. In terms of, connecting our stories, I think it depends on what the story is and what the community is in which we're working, et cetera. So I do think that, I'm really happy to be here today to make some connections. And like I say, I think our language capacity is increasing quite a bit at the agency.
You require some of your grantees, though, I imagine. I see the agency's blog and references to it in lots of different ways.
So we require them to use our logo if they're advertising something, but that doesn't mean that we're actually paying for the advertising. So if there's a program at a cultural organization that we've funded, like many other funders, we say, yes, so you've seen our logo on stuff. Right. But that's quite different. We're not paying for that advertising. We're not buying any advertising.
Gotcha. How does DCLA collaborate with the Arabic community to improve the image of Arabics amid the many stereotypes that Al-Arab.
So, the only thing I could say, we're a funding agency. So we fund stuff that other people do. So there are organizations like, One for the Arts is a grantee. I will say that there's a commission, a Percent for Art commission. So Percent for Art, commissions permanent public art. And there was a neighborhood called Little Syria in and we're involved right now in a commission related to that. It was an Arabic-speaking community. So whoever, I mean, I don't know who the person who asked that question was. Do you know about that commission? Okay, so that's something where we've been working on that, and I think it's going to be a very interesting. It's going to have text both in Arabic and English. You know but it's an example of something I think that'll be quite. And it's going to be right downtown, actually not far from where our agency is on the west side, lower in Manhattan. So there are projects like that, which are an individual project that might be. I will say also that there's a group called Arte East, which I don't know if you know that group, but it's mostly Arabic artists, and there's a Syrian refugee artist who's going to be welcoming to New York City. I'm going to be at that event next month. I could tell you about that as well.
Here's a question. Can an individual artist apply for the Public Artist in Residence program,
Yes.
regardless of immigration status? And what does the Public Artist in Residence mean?
Okay, so we have issued some RFPs for those public artists in residence. For example, the one I mentioned at the Administration for Children's Services was an RFP. Yeah, we don't inquire as to immigration status. You don't have to be, there's no immigration status question with the public artists in residence, and those it varies very much from residency to residency. But that's something to keep track of. Our website and all of our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And whenever we have a opportunity, it will be put forward. And Dion does our social media. So next time we have a public artist in residence, I'm sure you're going to be pushing that out on all our social media.
And are they working with the staff of those agencies or with the clients?
Both. So for example, at the ACS one, they're actually in residence at these 4 LGBTQ foster homes for teens. So they're working directly with the young people there, but they're also working, with the staff quite a bit. There's, for example, the one artist who's at the Department of Design and Construction is working really just with the staff, because that's a design agency. They don't have a kind of clients that other agencies have.
Yeah, I have a few. What is the relationship between the Museum of the Moving Image and the city
So
and your agency?
yes. So the Museum of Moving Image, like the Metropolitan Museum or the Queens Museum, is one of those 33 institutions where we're the landlord and we are a funder. But like all those others, it's a private nonprofit on city property. So they get funding from us, but they're a private nonprofit organization.
Besides paying the rent and everything, you also give money to them?
Yes. And yes, correct.
You know that the media income in New York and in Queens for a lot of families is like $25,000–$30,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why so expensive to get there and to get to that institution and many other institutions? If I have a family of 4 or 3 wants to go there, it's $100 just to go there.
So the structure
and the city is paying.
Right. The admissions structure of many of the organizations, for example, the Metropolitan Museum and Natural History and the Museum of the City of New York, Brooklyn Museum, et cetera, is a voluntary contribution model, right? Some are and some aren't. And this actually has to do with the enabling legislation when they opened. So there are many museums in New York you can go to for free. One of the questions is, do people know that, right? So one of the things that would be great, in terms of getting the folks in New York City who are paying the taxes, who are supporting these organizations, is to really understand the opportunity that there's no, problem walking into the Metropolitan Museum and giving 1 penny. I mean, when I was a young artist, that's what I did.
Yeah, but that's not the case in the Museum of the Moving Image or also the Hall of Science.
Right. So what I'm saying is that there's certain
to enter there is like $30.
Not for one person, but I know what you're saying. So there, no, you're right.
Yeah.
So there are institutions, and I'll get to that. Good point. There are institutions that, because of the enabling legislation, et cetera, are charging money not voluntary, right?
Yep.
Hall of Science is one of those. One of the things that we did this year, again, was that municipal ID. If you have a municipal ID, you can get a 1-year free membership to those organizations. And again, 400,000 free memberships have been given out. Now that's just 1 year, but at least you can go in there and get your free membership. And tens of thousands of people have done that, even at just individual institutions. Some institutions like Brooklyn Academy of Music, it's not free, but it's a discounted. You go to a film or a presentation, and instead of it costing $12, it costs $6 or something. So it is, there are many institutions that are free because of the public subsidy, and there's some that are not. There's no question, you're right.
Yeah, I have another question.
Yes.
It's more
By the way, I want to say, I really appreciate hard questions. I'm not the least bit. I thank you so much. And these are important questions to be considering also for the cultural plan. Like, so what is it that bugs you about what we're doing or what we're doing wrong? Or of course, I'd like to hear what we're doing right.
I never go to the Hall of Science because it's too expensive. That's
Right,
it.
they do have free hours and they have free days. So one of the things, though, so this is actually important to know that all those organizations, for example, the Bronx Zoo is free on Wednesdays. Tens of thousands. If you go to the Bronx Zoo on a Wednesday, it is packed. Absolutely. If you go to the Hall of Science, and I don't know what the hours are, but it's on the website, there are free hours, and many, many families from Queens take advantage of that, believe me. There are opportunities to go for free.
Yeah, my last question is just a philosophical question. What the play Hamilton is telling you and teaching the city? What is your take on that?
Well, so, Hamilton, yeah. So first of all, I think it is that Hamilton was developed at one of these cultural institution group, right? So it was developed at the Public Theater. And I think, I don't, it might have been possible to develop it on Broadway, but to have theaters, the nonprofit theater community like that, be able to, foster something experimental like that. I think that Hamilton has proven a lot. When we looked at our demographics of who's working at cultural institutions, theater turned out to be worse than the other fields. So interestingly enough, we have now these grants for theater. So what's on stage in New York is really much better in terms of diversity than it's been in a long time. It's really quite impressive. Mm-hmm. The people working at the cultural institutions need to become more diverse. So there's going to be $2 million worth of grants to diversify the staffs of cultural institutions. That's going to be announced, I don't know, sometime in the next couple of months. One of the things it is incredible, and I think it's so great that there are all those kids going for free to Hamilton. But when they walk in the door and they see people on the stage, they think, that's what a job in the arts looks like. Guess what? Most of the jobs in the arts are, you're working in PR, you're working in development, you're working in administration, you're working, as a writer or a director. So our grants for diversity in theater were for all the jobs that aren't on the stage. And we want, folks to understand that there's so many other ways to make an actual living than just being on stage. So have you seen Hamilton?
No, it's too expensive.
I saw it at the Public Theater, and it was really, I have to say, one of those things where you knew it. It wasn't yet, it was quite successful from the very beginning, but it's like, oh my gosh, this is like a transformative moment for theater, I thought. And Lin-Manuel Miranda is a guy that went to public schools right through, and that's one of the things is like, really great public school arts education is so important, because if we don't have it, we're going to miss the next Lin-Manuel Miranda coming out of, family in Washington Heights or wherever.
Yeah, and Hamilton also, if you are in a public school, you can go for, I believe, $10, and it's paid by the corporation. Yeah.
Can I make one? So I noticed on the RSVP list that we had several Chinese language newspapers coming here, World Journal or whatever. Yeah, Xingda Daily. One of the things that we were having trouble, when we were meeting in the Hall of Science in Queens, actually we had quite a few Latinos were there, and we had Spanish language tables. We had the capacity for Mandarin and Cantonese, but we had Mandarin tables. There were very few people there. So I really would love to talk further about how we get the word out, which is not to say we don't want to. We want to talk to everybody. Everybody is super important. We did feel that that was a big, we hadn't been communicating that well enough. So if we can follow up sometime.
That brings us to the end of this hour. Thank you so much for coming by. I know some folks are going to want to do some follow-ups.
Yes,
maybe
yes.
some stand-ups and photos and all that stuff. But please join me in thanking the commissioner for coming by this afternoon.
You have to go to bed. I'm describing it.
So,
Yeah, you're tired. You know, there's an app for the lottery for Hamilton. And you sign up one time, and then every day it tells you when the lottery's open. You can just say if you want to sign up.
You can also go to the
Yeah.
and they allow some people to play. Let's see.